Hi, welcome to Celebrating Culture. We're coming to you from Felix's Restaurant and Oyster Bar on Lake Pontchartrain. Felix's has restaurants in downtown Lake Pontchartrain and other places. Their Oyster Bar, their weekends, it's just great for music. It's a way New Orleanians really enjoy life. Oysters are a tremendous part of Louisiana culture. We're going to showcase specialty oysters in this episode, the Charbroiled Oysters, Oysters Rockefeller, and select oysters. Stay tuned, we'll be right back. Celebrating Culture is brought to you by Awe News. Awe News also produces New Orleans Insider Tours, which are 10 self-guided tours of New Orleans and Louisiana. To download the apps, all you have to do is point your phone at the flow code in the camera mode, and you're ready to really experience Louisiana. Here we have Boris and Marcus Guerrero, who have come up with a great idea for raising oysters, premium oysters, out of Grand Isle.
We get this idea because from the start we wanted to have sustainable food, so a way to grow organic agriculture. Yes, the main difference is the flavor. We got a really good flavor out of the waters of Caminada Bay.
Here we are at Caminada Bay. That's where we grow our premium oysters, of bottom cultural oyster. You see, we have a lot of wind, a lot of current here that create a lot of food for the oyster. Within these waters, you can taste the Caminada Bay flavor. That's why it's so unique and so wonderful flavor in the end.
What they've created is essentially this perfect oyster all the time. They can control the perfect oyster. They've taken what we know that grew naturally here, they put a little bit of thought into it, elevated it just a touch, and created a unique product.
This beautiful Caminada Bay oyster, we're very excited to have them today at the restaurant. They really have that freshness, have that saltiness, that floral, that creamy, rich nuances that you look in an oyster. These farmers are nurturing these oysters like babies. So I think the flavor just represents everything that they do.
And now we're in Bourbon Street with Dickie Brennan. Dickie, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Glad to have you.
You're educating people. Oysters are like wine. They have a different texture where they come from. Do you have a map?
When we opened here, it was about trying to educate people a little bit more than just give me a dozen oysters. We know where the oysters are coming from. We know the person who's harvesting. If we have 28 areas that you can harvest in Louisiana waters, area 1 through 8 east of the Mississippi River. Then you have another 20 areas going west. But areas 1 through 8, probably 80% of the production of oysters comes out of those areas. I call that a honey hole.
Where people can come here and have like a pairing.
Oh,
where
absolutely.
You can take them through from the beginning.
We've brought oyster farmers in, and they've participated with the chefs, and throughout the dinner, they tell their story. We are continuing to work with these individuals because they're really a boutique farmers as opposed to a commodity farmer. I'm sitting there with them on the last field trip, and I'm like, what's the difference between the one that's flat or the one that has that little pocket?
Sure.
And so there's so many different versions of this variety. And so what we're trying to do is really even pinpoint on, all right, give me these. I want the small one that has the deep little belly, that goes way into the shell.
All right.
See how deep that shell is?
Yes.
And then you'll have some that are flat. To be able to bring select oysters coming out of our waters instead of coming from the east to the west coast, that's kind of our goal.
In 2013, they passed a new aquaculture park in Grand Isle. This is the first time in Louisiana that was allowed to have an aquaculture park for oysters. It all starts with the hatchery. The lab gives us the seed. We bring it to a nursery on land. We put the little seed into these mesh bags, and then we basically put them out in the water. We have a boat that goes and picks them up. We have a little ramp that takes them into the boat, and then we start harvesting, pulling out basically the mesh bags.
We combine the technology, the culture technology, with the breeding program and its results, and the hatchery technology to produce a very sustainable seafood, and in this case it's oysters. And in an oyster's case, they're also filter feeders, so they're very advantageous to the environment. So here is an example of sea farming that works very, very well, and part of the reason is there's no food input. They're filtering natural algae assemblages in the water, so we're not adding feed to the water, which in some fish farming cases can be not very advantageous to the environment. It's a win-win for everyone here.
Hatcheries have been around for some time. We in the Gulf, we were just blessed. We didn't need them. So Hurricane Katrina comes, and we're looking for a way that we can try to reestablish the oyster reefs and jumpstart them and then keep it going so we had a public oyster productivity like we always did. It took until after the Deepwater Horizon oil disaster to get the funding through the early restoration funds that were made available by British Petroleum and the state of Louisiana to build and break ground on this Michael C. Voisin oyster hatchery.
This is not a new way to raise oysters, but it's new to Louisiana, it's new to the Gulf. And so these guys went out and then they decided that let's try something else. There is a better way to do it. We don't have to rake, lift the sediment and all these things. And so the cages allowed them to raise this oyster. The oysters, it's like bacon on a wire rack. Okay. You have circulation all around the oyster. If these are stuck in the mud, just like they're stuck in this ice, it's only beating the top shell. Well, those oysters grow, they're together like this, and you'll see them beat them. Well, only some of that oyster is going to get submerged in that salt, and they breathe, they open, but it's the sunshine. They raise them out, they get a little of that light. There's a little bit of everything that they do just intensifies that flavor. The oysters are just a touch smaller than, say this, our beautiful Gulf oyster that have been growing off of the reef for 2 years, and these have been raised in beds, lowered and raised, and the shell's more polished. You can see the shell's a little more rough, a little more rustic. And so all of these shells do a great job. After the oysters are shucked, we bring the shells every day back to our recycle bins, and then they're picked up on a daily basis to bring back, to put back in the Gulf. So it's just it's a true form of sustainability from the oysters raised down on the reefs, pulled out through cages as not to disturb the sediment down on the coast, brought to the restaurant, served to the people, give employment to people to be able to shuck oysters, brought back to the recycle to build reefs to stop the coastal erosion. And I've been very fortunate to go around the world and have oysters in Europe and oysters all over. When they're at the peak of the season, in those cold days in South Louisiana, when the water's right, I know that there's not a better oyster in the world than the Gulf oyster. Right. When they're nice sized, when the salinity's right, it's perfect.
Hi, we hope you've enjoyed this episode of Celebrating Culture. On News has interviewed hundreds of people and produced dozens of episodes for local broadcasting of awesome people doing great things to inspire us all. If you'd like to watch a specific interview, please visit our YouTube channel and subscribe. Today, I'm with Tommy Cvitanovich, the owner of Drago's restaurant, the creator of the Charbroiled Oyster, one of the most favorite staples of New Orleans. Every tourist comes down here. Drago's has expanded over the years. You're now in Jackson, Mississippi, downtown in the Hilton, and makes a fabulous oyster and many other dishes. Tommy, welcome to the show.
Nice to see you. The oyster industry here is dominated by Croatians from all levels, from the fishermen to the dealers to the restaurants. And the oyster bars here in town, lots of Croatian influence here. In Croatia, it's a coastal country, and there's a little village called Ston there, where that's what they're famous for, is growing oysters. When those people immigrated here, they got into the oystering, and it was hard work, and these people are hard workers, and it was an opportunity, and they took advantage of the opportunity. I pretty much grew up in the restaurant industry. I'm what we call a restaurant brat. Done every job. My first job here was peeling shrimp. I've done everything from opening oysters to cooking to maitre d' to bartending to, taking out the garbage, everything. I just love what we do here. In 3 restaurants this year, we've served over 4 million oysters. Well, Charbroiled Oysters, it's fun. We used to do a dish called drumfish. It was a drumfish dish that we left the skin and scales on the fish, and kind of like a red fish on the half shell. We used to do that dish, and we used to baste it with a butter garlic sauce. And in describing that dish, I would always say the skin and scales act as a second plate, and they hold all the natural juices and bastings in to make it a very juicy product. And then so I'm thinking that in the back of my mind, and I'm thinking, everybody always talks about oyster water, and so that's the the natural juices, and then the basting, this butter garlic sauce. I wonder what would happen if I took an oyster on the half shell, put it on a barbecue grill, and then put that sauce on there that we do on the redfish and the drumfish, and it was like, wow, this is actually pretty good. As long as I can remember, I remember the bumper sticker, eat fish, live longer, eat oysters, love longer. And people have always talked about, oysters being an aphrodisiac, and it was always that sexy type of meal that you're going to eat. And so yeah, it makes a lot of sense. You hear about these rhino horns, and they're grinding it up, and and serving it to people, and then I've even heard where they're adding to it by crumpling up a little bit, grinding up some Viagra and putting it on top of that. And I don't know what they do over there, but I'm going to tell you, we don't need to put Viagra on top of oysters. Our oysters work by themselves. They're good, they're strong, and they're awesome. They keep talking about these rhino horns and how the rhino may become extinct because of this. Well, I can tell you, there's lots and lots of oysters out there. We do not have to worry about oysters becoming extinct. And on top of that, it tastes good. It tastes good whether it's raw, whether it's fried on a po' boy, whether you're just taking the oyster and dipping it in tartar sauce, or if you charbroil it with the butter, garlic, and cheese. It's just a great dish, and you can bake them, you can do the Rockefeller, there's just so many different ways to do this, and none of them are bad. Oysters, they're always good. I'm not sure how eating oysters started, but I'm gonna tell you one thing for sure. The guy that did it, the guy that first got to find an oyster and eat it, he was one hungry person to see, because when you see an oyster, what we see at an oyster bar, it's a nice round single oyster. Well, before, when it comes out of the water, that comes out as a cluster, and you got an oyster fisherman or farmer, he's got a hammer, and he takes this cluster of nasty looking rocks, and he's sitting there with a hammer hitting it, and all of the stuff is falling off, and he ends up with one oyster. And then to think of that first guy takes that one oyster and then opens it up and then takes the flesh out of it and just eats it. It's just like, that was one hungry man, and good for him. What makes Louisiana oysters so good is it's that constant mixing of the fresh water from the Mississippi River and the salt water from the Gulf. And it's a constant, when I say a constant mixing, in the morning you'll have a freshwater wash going over it, in the afternoon you'll have a saltwater wash, depending on which way the tide's going. So on a daily basis, you're getting different, we call it brackish water, but even in brackish water, sometimes you got brackish water that's more fresh, and sometimes you have brackish water that's more salty. And that's what makes the oysters really, really good here. Other parts of the country, the oysters are predominantly either fresh water or salt water. Here it's that constant mixing. That's why our oysters are usually fatter, plumper. They grow a whole lot nicer. It's just a very unique lay of the land that we have here that makes this happen. And an oyster bed is not something that you can just pick up and move. An oyster bed takes years and years to develop. Coastal restoration absolutely has to be carefully done, and you've got to be careful, because whatever you do, it's going to alter something. Do we need coastal restoration? Absolutely. But at what expense, number one? Number two, what residual damage that's going to happen because of it. An oyster can't live in all salt water. An oyster can't live in all fresh water. So now, this perfect area of growing that I was talking about now has to move, and it doesn't happen overnight. It takes, first off, an oyster takes 2 to 3 years to become marketable. From a spat to an oyster is almost 3 years, but you can't just put it in mud or an area just anywhere. It's got to be an area where you have the rock bottoms and not mud bottoms and shells, and it can't just be 3 inches of shells. It's got to be a big depth of shells. An oyster bed is not something that's built overnight or in 2 or 3 years. It takes decades.
Tommy, thanks for being on the show.
My pleasure.
Celebrating Culture is brought to you by Awe News. Awe News also produces New Orleans Insider Tours, which are 10 self-guided tours of New Orleans and Louisiana. To download the apps, all you have to do is point your phone at the flow code in the camera mode, and you're ready to really experience Louisiana.
Hi,
welcome back to Celebrating Culture. We're here at Antoine's in the Rex Room with Rick Blunt. Rick, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So fill us in. Antoine's gets started in 1840. You're like the first restaurant in New Orleans.
You know, it's a bit of a misnomer maybe because my great-great-grandfather Antoine started Antoine's in 1840. But in the mid-1800s, restaurants were more a division of a hotel than they were a standalone business. You know, we hadn't invented things like refrigeration and menus and, you know, several things that you would think of in the restaurant business today.
Now, as the restaurant evolves, you have 4 major carnival clubs. We're in the Rex Room now. How did Antoine's become the place for Mardi Gras?
Even a very, very long time ago, Antoine's was sort of the meeting spot. You know, they were here talking about forming Mardi Gras. It just sort of was natural to have the next meeting here because they just had the previous meeting here. I don't think they moved here later.
Right.
It sort of grew.
It's just started here, they're having dinner.
Yeah.
They envisioned.
And envisioning putting together this today seems sort of a way out thing. How in the world could you ever envision something this big? That, you know, from nothing. I'm sure that the gentlemen that did that were just doing it over great food and a bottle of wine here at Antoine's.
So in those rooms, I mean, I'm looking at the Rex Room, you've got photos of the kings, you've got, I mean, you can come here and see a museum while you're having a dinner.
Isn't that amazing? I mean, I think that is so cool. We have the availability to this beautiful memorabilia.
Oysters Rockefeller, tell me this story.
Rockefeller's yet another one of those great culinary mistakes that worked out. My great-grandfather's name was Jules, and Jules had been sent to France to study cuisine and so on. And so he came back and he's taken over the restaurant from his dad, Antoine, and he's playing around in the kitchen with an escargot recipe. And the classic preparation for escargot was, butter and garlic and parsley, the bouillon sauce.
Sure, yeah.
And he's fooling around with that sauce, but he wants to make a better one. He says, that's great, we could copy the French and do the bouillon sauce, but boy, it'd be great if it was even tastier than that. And so he starts putting in all of those, today we call Creole vegetables, the onion and green onion and parsley and celery and so on. He starts putting all those vegetables into this butter garlic sauce, and the sauce tightens up. The sauce gets thick, which changed the nature of the sauce completely. And so he's sort of piping this new concoction that he's made in a pot onto escargot and serving it to his guests, and it was, reasonably successful. And by all crazy circumstances, New Orleans runs out of escargot.
That's what I heard.
Escargot were all grown in France and shipped as a protein here. And so he started using his sauce that he had on a local product that had a shell. So it was cooked the same way he was cooking the escargot. And so he put it on an oyster. He copied the oyster dish in the sort of the same cooking techniques in typical Creole fashion. He used an ingredient that was here with the same sort of processes that he would have used in Europe with a different product. I have no idea if Jules was the first guy to ever bake an oyster, but it also started this whole idea of, wow, it's cool to bake oysters, not fry them, not eat them raw, but actually create sauces and bake them. So it's a whole genre of cooking techniques and so on, in addition to just Rockefeller.
You get a number when you order the oysters, right?
Yeah, we still do that.
You still do that. What are you up to now?
I don't know, it's 4 million and something, but
4 million orders of oysters.
Yeah, that's more of a gesture. I have no idea how many oysters we've really served, but that's a good clicker, that's a good counter. I know that it's millions more than that.
And the recipe is kept a secret?
The recipe's still for fun. We've always sort of kept the recipe a secret. It turns out that it's really a difficult dish to do. It's a difficult sauce to make. It's very time consuming to make the sauce the way we do it. And we do keep that process still proprietary because it's fun to do that.
I want to thank you for being on the show. This is a fabulous place. It's one of my favorite places to come to in New Orleans. If you really want to experience a museum and fine dining at the same time, this is the place to be. Stay tuned, we'll be right back with more of Celebrating Culture. Hi, welcome back to Celebrating Culture. We're here at Deanie's Seafood in Bucktown, and I'm with Miss Barbara Chifici, and she is known as Deanie, but you're not really Deanie.
No.
So let's start at the beginning, because you and your husband studied in Paris.
Yes.
So fill me in, you get married and you're off to Paris?
I got married at 19, and my husband and I left to go live in France. He was going to Le Cordon Bleu. I do not know one word in French, but he learned quite a bit, and I actually learned things from him.
So then you started with restaurants in the uptown area of New Orleans.
We actually started catering from our house as soon as we came back. From that, we first opened an Italian restaurant on Magazine Street, and the opportunity came up for us to acquire Deanie's. And I thought my husband was crazy, but it worked out well for us.
That was 1982.
Yes, it was.
And then a few years later, unfortunately, your husband passed away.
Yes,
But then you took charge, 1985, and you bought out your partners.
I did.
And then we have Deanie's today, which is in Bucktown. Tell me the story about Bucktown.
Oh, Bucktown was an old fishing village. And as I was growing up, you heard stories about Bucktown. Never did really come out here. There are many stories circulating around, but Bucktown used to be a lot of fishing camps. It was a fishing village. They had a lot of bars, houses of prostitution, you name it, they had it here. I think they had a little bootlegging going on also out this way.
July 4th is the blessing of the fleet.
Yes.
And there's still a big fireworks in Bucktown Harbor now.
Well, they had stopped the blessing of the fleet. And a few years ago, I decided we should bring this back in this area.
You've been in business now for 35 years.
Deanie's is one of the first restaurants to be certified in serving Louisiana seafood. And to be certified, you have to prove that 90% of your seafood comes from Louisiana waters. My reputation is we're one of the places where the locals like to eat.
And we're enjoying the seafood. We got the catfish right here in the house. We got the crawfish. It's almost gone. Almost gone. And the shrimps, they barely hanging in there. So y'all come on out. We got the oysters and all. It's good. It's very delicious.
Your kids stepped into the business.
My husband and I decided when each one reached 16 years old, they didn't have any choice. They had to come to work. On their birthday, each one started as a regular employee so they could see where this money was coming from. They put the clothes on their back, the food in their plate, etc.
Really, on their birthday?
On their birthday.
What are your children's names?
All of them?
Yeah, all of them.
Mark, Darren, Eric, Keith, Garrett, Chandra, and Candace. I have 7.
And they all, on their 16th birthday, show up at Deanie's?
Yes.
Did they have cake at all later at home, or did?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
And Chandra, which store is she running right now?
She has the Deanie Seafood Kitchen on Magazine in Jackson.
I'm with Chandra Chifici, who is the co-owner of Deanie's. Second generation, right?
Yeah.
Welcome to the show.
Thanks for coming.
Now, your mom says that when you turn 16, your birthday present is you report to work for your first day.
Yeah, but that wasn't my first day, but yeah. Yes. I did report to work when I was 16, but I was doing it before that too.
That's a Chifici custom that all the kids turn 16 and their birthday present is now you're going to punch a card.
Well, absolutely. I mean, to me, in any Italian family that owns a restaurant, you're going to work. We understood that at a young age, so I'm fine with that. I've been working my whole life. I'll probably work till I die.
What was your first position in the restaurant?
The first thing I ever remember doing was standing on a milk crate in the retail store learning to peel a shrimp. And then I used to always get seasoning in my eye when I was a kid from the boil. And I remember one day I got in my eye and it was bad. And my dad was standing there and he said, "What's the matter?" I'm like, "I got seasoning in my eye." He stuck my whole head under the faucet to get it out. I was all wet after that.
Oysters. What makes oysters so Louisianan?
Well, you know, it's a delicacy. Anything that comes from Louisiana, it's like nowhere else. Whether it be shrimp, crabs, crawfish, oysters is right up there with that. It's something in the water that makes everything just taste better in Louisiana. The best time to eat this is certain times of the year. The R months is the best time to eat a raw oyster. September through April, anything with an R in it. It's the cooler months of the year when that water is getting to that cooler point and it gets to that perfect temperature and it makes the perfect raw oyster. You know, raw oysters, a lot of it is preference. Some people like them small, some people like them bigger. People like horseradish with it, some people just like the ketchup horseradish. combo, which is a cocktail sauce. Some people just do put lemon on them.
So what do we have here? How would we do this?
Well, this is a dozen raw oysters that we would serve in the dining room at any one of our locations. Serve it always with some lemon and our cocktail sauce that we just made in-house.
How would we go about it? What's the first steps here?
Some people eat it right off the shell. They'll pick it up and
Yep.
they'll just eat it right off the shell.
But I think you're doing a little bit of lemon on them.
Some people do, some people don't. Yes, you could squirt the lemon on it if you'd like.
I'm a lemon fan.
There you go.
Okay.
And actually, they do it this way. They hold it by the thicker part.
Oh, the thicker part like
Right,
this?
and then
All
they
right.
suck it right off the shell.
Like this?
Yes.
Wow.
There you go.
That is perfect. Well, you also, besides the restaurant, you also have the market.
We do. We have one of the oldest seafood markets here at the Bucktown location in Jefferson Parish. We sell crawfish, crabs, shrimp, live and boiled seafood. And you know, it's a continuous thing that we've done from year to year to live on what Miss Deanie started originally. She was a pioneer in the seafood business, and my dad and my mom were too, and took it over from her.
Great.
So it was great. It's a good experience.
So you guys have a website.
Our website is www.deanies.com, and all 3 restaurants are featured on that site.
Chandra, I want to thank you for being on the
Thank
show,
you.
and I'm going to enjoy finishing off these oysters. So, Ms. Barbara, I want to thank you for being on the show.
You're welcome.
And I've loved Deanie's for decades, so I mean, appreciate all you've done for New Orleans and everything. And if you're coming down New Orleans and you want to know how a local does seafood, go to Deanie's. You got 3 choices: the French Quarter, Uptown, and out here in Metairie. It's just a great experience for oysters and all seafoods, actually.
Well, thank you very much.
Hi, we hope you've enjoyed this episode on Celebrating Culture. Coming to you from Deanie's Seafood in Bucktown. Deanie's also has restaurants in the French Quarter and Uptown New Orleans. Bucktown has a farmer's market every Friday, and Deanie's Seafood puts on a great festival every year. Louisiana seafood festivals are a great way to experience our culture and feed your soul.
Not a bad way to spend an afternoon or the morning, huh? All right.
So that's where the food is. That's where most oxygen is too. So they're happier oysters.
Do they dance in the game?
A little bit. They dance a little, a little bit of that.
I'm gonna have to eat this because I pulled it out. Oh.
I'm going to join you because I've been looking at this too long.